Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. A couple of weeks ago on this channel we looked at the birth of the Double Dragon series and just how important the maiden entry from the popular line of games has been to gaming overall. The original Double Dragon game brought a lot of things to the table. The game was the world's first cooperative two-player beat-em-up where players got to take control of Bimmy and Jimmy through a whole range of side-scrolling stages. The game built on everything that Technos had delivered in their previous work when they released Neketsu Koha Kunio-kun, the smash hit pioneering game that was reskinned as Renegade in the West. When you consider that Double Dragon was even more successful than Renegade, it is of no surprise that Technos would have more plans for their breakout franchise. In today's video we are going to take a deep dive look at Double Dragon Sequel, a game released just one short year after the original, that was arguably even more impactful on gaming culture than that of the original game. What was it that this game did that the first game didn't? And how did this rub off on gaming's future? Let's find out. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of Double Dragon 2 The Revenge, the beat 'em up game that changed everything. Yeah! As we know, Double Dragon was one of the biggest arcade releases of 1987. The game, designed by Yoshihisa Kishimoto, was unlike anything anyone had ever played before, and the game's cooperative nature ensured that pairs of players would insert many coins into the cabinets that hosted this delightful game. What may now come as a surprise to you is that despite the game's success, Technos never immediately had a straight up sequel in mind, but instead Kishimoto and co were tasked with creating an upgrade kit for Double Dragon cabinets across the world to provide a more refined experience. If you watched my last video covering Double Dragon or have memories of playing it yourself, as revolutionary as it was, it had its fair share of problems. For example, the game's cooperative feature will result in the game running with severe slowdown, so an updated version of the game with some new levels and smoother gameplay would have been some welcome additions to the game. However, through the development cycle of this upgrade kit, the game's increased memory size would be too tantalising for Kishimoto and his team not to end up turning the upgrade project into a full-blown standalone sequel instead. Keeping this in mind though, there are still some elements in the game that indicate that at one point the game was indeed intended to be an upgrade. For example, there are many assets in Double Dragon 2 that have simply been reused from the original. Reflecting on this, what went down here seems similar in many ways to when Nintendo released The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, an experimental title that borrowed a ton of assets from the Ocarina of Time. But once again, the reason for this was that the game was originally just going to be an expansion pack known as Zelda Gaiden, which was set to be delivered via the Nintendo 64 disk drive, the console add-on that would serve as Nintendo's only hardware flop that would sell even worse than the Virtual Boy. Like Majora's Mask, Double Dragon 2 was a huge success and built on everything that the original game included. Speaking of the original game, the title follows the plot of two brothers, Jimmy and Billy, who go on a quest to save Billy's girlfriend Marion, who has been kidnapped by the Black Warriors gang. Double Dragon 2, on the other hand, takes a much more sinister approach, as the Black Warriors gang return, but rather than kidnapping the girl this time, they just shoot poor Marion to death, thus taking revenge against the brothers after the events that unfolded in the previous game. Obviously the theme of revenge runs through the title throughout, as quite clearly this time around Billy and Jimmy are out for revenge rather than trying to save anyone this time, which is obviously where the game Double Dragon 2 The Revenge gets its title from in the first place. Away from a starkly different storytelling approach, shifting from the damsel in distress narrative over to a revenge narrative, another major change between the two entries are the game's controls themselves. Double Dragon 2 introduces to the series two directional based attack buttons, a left attack and a right attack. What this basically means is that if players press the attack button of the player's current direction, they will do a standard series of punches, while pressing the opposite attack button will perform a back kick. There are other new moves added into the gameplay too. For example, players can now perform the hurricane kick maneuver. Like the original game, the game features 4 stages to get through, all of which we will cover in a bit more detail soon. In terms of enemies to take down, many sprites return from the previous title. However, many feature new colour palette swaps along with new attacks too. Another big change with this game from the original is that the amount of weapons that can be picked up and used has been increased exponentially, giving players a lot more choice with what can be used this time around. The most pleasant change to the flow of gameplay though, in my opinion, is that Technos made major improvements in terms of how well Double Dragon runs. The Revenge, while still suffering from slowdown here and there, it is nowhere near as riddled with it as that of the original, which is a fantastic improvement considering that these two games launched just one short year apart. But overall, this makes Double Dragon 2 much more comfortable to play than that of the first game. After witnessing Marion's murder, action starts out in this game within a heliport, and there are handlebarred mustachioed gentlemen to beat down in this helicopter-tastic setting. Players get to take on a boss early on when they fight an opponent who looks like something straight out of Mad Bloody Max. Defeating this Thunderdome reject brings this extremely short stage to a close, bringing arcade players a sense of accomplishment very early on. A feature I like in this game is the game's stage transitions. Rather than simply cutting from one stage to the next, the players enter a lift in this instance and the camera pans down the building as Billy and Jimmy exit the lift below. This helps the game, in my opinion, feel more like a living, breathing world, despite how basic this game's actual graphics are. Interestingly, the stage starts out with a fight against a large opponent, subverting expectations when you consider these sort of fights always took place at the end of stages in previous games. Once you take out the character that looks like the love child of Roman Reigns and Peter Sutcliffe, the game scrolls right in a traditional side-scrolling manner into an industrial setting which turns out to be a lumber storehouse. As you take down enemies throughout this stage, it becomes clear very quickly that this stage is a rehash of stage 2 from the previous game, with ladders and platforms to jump across and even a section with a conveyor belt. The fact that this game started out as a mere upgrade of the original is more evident than ever within this section. Players take on a large fatty Boom Boom wearing sunglasses here too, but defeating him brings players onto the next stage. Once again we get another cool stage transition, once again involving a lift before action resumes. Scenery starts out looking similar to when players exit the industrial area in the original game. However, once players pass the building section here, they arrive in a farming area as opposed to a woodland area like last time around. This is emphasised further with the weapons that can be used, for example large throwable logs, that further illustrate that the brothers are fighting in the great outdoors. Fighting in this game is more fluid than ever, and there are constantly colourful sprites on screen to take out. The farming aspect of this stage though is constantly drawn upon, including areas where players fight in front of a field of cows, with accompanying mooing sound effects, and even a brand new combine harvester, and I'll give you the key. Once the brothers have ruled their way through the farmland, players must fight against 2 Thunderdome fatties, who are recycled sprites of the end boss from stage 1. Defeating this gruesome twosome allows players to ascend the lift to the doors of the Black Warriors gang's hideout. But first the brothers must defeat a whole range of Roman Sutcliffes to advance. Eventually the boss of the stage emerges, Chintamai, an agile martial artist who fights with Kali sticks, which he never drops when knocked down, allowing for no easy win sadly. Once inside the gang's hideout, the level of challenge continues to be ramped up, forcing players to immediately face multiple Kali stick wielding foes through this eastern setting riddled with riches and antiques. Like the gang's hideout in the previous game, there are also various traps here to avoid, such as statues with moving spears, laser eyes and walls where the bricks shoot out in players' paths. In this stage, where players do a lot of ascending downwards, as if they were going into the depths of hell themselves, there are plenty of powerful palette swaps of previous enemies to cause more of a hindrance along the way. Eventually, players reach a room that looks strikingly similar to the setting where the final boss fight occurred in the previous game, which is another example of background assets being reused for this title. The balcony is even back here, featuring the leader of the gang, Willie, watching on as players fight through wave after wave of opponents in these final throes of the game. Eventually he comes down with a machine gun in tow once more, a weapon which is far more scary than anything seen in the game up until this point. Defeating this intimidating foe though does not bring the game to a close quite yet, as after the room goes dark and some eerie sound effects occur, you go one-on-one with the Undertaker! Now hold on a minute players, because that's not exactly what happens. In an equally spooky moment, shadowy figures emerge from the brothers' bodies, who are the game's final bosses to beat in a tag team match, players. These tough doppelgangers can not only perform all of the boys' attacks and wield them against the players, but they can additionally drain the players' energy if they get close enough too. After this long and arduous encounter, the longest fight in the game, players finally enter the door at the back of the building, bringing the game to a close. The closing image of the game shows both of the brothers standing with Marion in a symbolic ending, where she sheds a tear that splashes and forms, spelling out the end, finally closing out this experience. Like other Double Dragon games, the title would be ported to a number of systems that were popular back in the day. The first of these were for home computers and microcomputer formats that were popular throughout Europe, and many of these versions were ready as quickly as 1989, just 1 year after the game's initial arcade release. Many of these ports were handled by Binary Design, the same company who developed a number of ports of the first game for computers too. As you can see, these versions across various hardware tried their best to replicate the arcade game on their respective pieces of hardware. A more notable version of the game would arrive on the NES in 1990, 2 years after the arcade release. Bearing in mind how popular this one platform was for gaming, this port on the other hand was handled by Technos themselves, and rather than being a direct porting of the original game, the NES version is more distinct in an attempt to play to the console's strengths. This version of the game offers players 3 varied difficulty levels, each of which allow players to progress further into the game upon completion. Rather than showing Marion get shot dead in this one, because I guess Nintendo censorship, instead this scenario is explained through text prior to gameplay unfolding. The game obviously features scaled back NES graphics, but lots of new sections to further pad the game out. For example, the opening stage is no longer super short and players continue to brawl across rooftops past the point of just a heliport. Like the first NES game, this version has lots of full 2D platforming too, as what would be an NES game without lots of platforming, eh? The more you look at this game, the more you realise it's pretty much a different game to that of the arcade one, as there is just tons here that is not in the other version, like these helicopters that shoot the player for example. The game has been really fleshed out for a console experience. Speaking of all of this expansion content this game got on the system, there are a whopping 9 stages in total in the Nintendo version of the title, and thankfully 2-player co-op is now possible too, a feature that was sorely lacking in the NES original, which I joked before should have just been called Dragon. Obviously, being on primitive 8-bit hardware, there are still some shortcomings present here, outside of just the graphical differences. For example, only 2 enemy sprites can appear on screen at the same time in this game, but overall, Double Dragon 2 The Revenge on the NES is bloody fantastic in what it offers, especially compared to the original game on the system. Next, a Double Dragon 2 game would appear on the Sega Mega Drive in 1991. Since the Mega Drive was a more powerful 16-bit system, this allowed Powsoft, the developers of this version, to release a much closer port of the arcade game on the hardware than what was done with the NES title. Being a console game though, some of the stages were fleshed out and made longer, which is highly noticeable on the second stage for example. For some reason the sprites in this game are much smaller than those that appeared in the arcade game, and even the previous Mega Drive Double Dragon game for that matter too. Now, perhaps one of the coolest versions of Double Dragon 2 would arrive in 1993, this time with the game arriving on the PC Engine Super CD-ROM. In this crazy version of the game that was published by Naxat Soft exclusively over in Japan, we get a game based off of the NES version as opposed to another arcade port. This version features animated cutscenes, which even feature Japanese voice acting, along with a number of other cool changes too, such as an even more refined combat system and obviously much better graphics due to the game running on PC Engine hardware. The version features all new CD audio music too, and some of the stages have been altered even further once again. Double Dragon 2 The Revenge is really a whole series of games, rather than just one simple title, like the name would have you believe. So there are many great games that feature the name Double Dragon 2. As good as all of these games are though, prior to all of these ports, some of Double Dragon 2's greatest impacts arrived prior to any home port ever was even released. Shortly after the release of a Japanese arcade game in 1988, developers everywhere were blown away with how refined this game was and what it could offer consumers. Due to this, the bosses at large development houses would order their employees to create games that were inspired by Double Dragon 2. Two of the most notable examples of this arrived as quickly as 1 year later, in 1989. The first of these was Golden Axe by Sega, the first cooperative beat-em-up to make it to a 16-bit home console, or possibly any console for that matter. The game is set in a fantasy world by Makoto Uchida, and it only came about due to wanting to create a Double Dragon 2 style game. The second big hit of a game inspired that year was Final Fight by Capcom, another game shaped by Double Dragon 2, but this one inspired by the movie Streets of Fire aesthetically. Double Dragon was spawning a whole genre. Finally, it is of note that these two games that Double Dragon 2 inspired were the two key ingredients in the granddaddy of all beat-em-up series, Streets of Rage, as the Kashiros would create the first game in the series due to Sega wanting to create a game that looked and played like Final Fight, but used the already made Golden Axe engine. Double Dragon 2 The Revenge really was a game that changed everything, and a title that is still inspiring the release of games right up until this day. The game has played such an important role in gaming history and inspired so many classics. Where will we be today without Double Dragon 2? So ladies and gentlemen, that was the wonderful story of that game and how it changed everything. Let me know in the comment section down below which beat 'em up you would like to see me cover next. Make sure you like, subscribe and hit the notification bell if you want to ensure you see my future content. Today's video was chosen by the great people who back this channel over on Patreon. Receive early access on content, join my Discord and much more for as little as just $1 a month. I work on this platform full time because of you. Great guys. Huge shoutouts and thank yous go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, A Murder of Crows, A.O. Paulo Lopez, Joseph Rasmek, Doug Perkins, BXL Gotham, Normal Guy, Ryan Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Camera Rambo 82, Azra Rarakai, Keith Ferguson, Dropkin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ago, Jordan Durant, TOG Driver, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Carlos Domingos, Sponge Matt B, Glennie Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Aaron McNamara, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Posty XL, Michael Hall, Baba Kitty, Ron Stud, Uti McBoob, Langston Miller, Noob, Casey Wright, Zai, Brian Barry, Chris Margarine, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Vlaming Renee, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cool, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Marco Soto, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Crazy Yarl, Hans Christian, Time Lord Soundwave, Dan Van Darn, Adam Castin, Gregory Smoradiewicz, Rick67, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bow, Angry Little SOB, Mike Bruno, Chris Fisk, Ivan M, Paul Elliott, Mean Machine Dean, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, Retroverse.com, Synth Spaces and Andrew Bazansky. Thank you all of you so much for making my job just that little bit easier. I hope to entertain all of you for a long time to come. Yeah. Cheerio.